Yeah.
Thank you.
I just purchased it from here.
It's a wonderful place to purchase it from. I was just going to read a little bit, sort of to set the scene from toward the beginning of the book. The novel Fagin the Thief kind of starts with Fagin as a child. It picks up when he's about 6, and so the scene I'm going to read from, he's 10 or 11 years old, and he's just encountered a very talented pickpocket on the streets of London, and he's decided, that is what I want to do with my life. I want you to teach me how you do that. And so the short scene I'm going to read is Fagin's first attempt at picking a pocket. Lesson number 1, Leftwich says, as he walks and Jacob jogs, is to avoid habit at all costs. You can double back to somewhere with rich pickings all you want, he says over his shoulder, but do it irregular-like. As soon as you're known as someone with a usual hunting ground, you'll get cut, either by the runners or by someone who wants the same pockets you're after. So stay light, stay on the move. Understood? Jacob nods, fighting to breathe through his nose. Stay on the move. He's panting by the time Leftwich slows his pace, in a part of town Jacob has never visited before. Farther west yet than Spitalfields, the neighborhood appears well-to-do to his untrained eyes, though not so fine that his own dirty clothing draws attention. A mix of shop girls and servants and merchants taking a stroll chatter in at least 3 languages. The air smells of wood and dust and sweat, strong but not unpleasant. Jacob suspects Leftwich selected the street on purpose, a betwixt in-between place where poverty and riches brush elbows. Someday, he decides, he will have the same encyclopedic knowledge of the city and everyone in it. There now, Leftwich says. He doesn't point, but nods minutely toward a draper's shop, outside which the seller has arrayed a table with fine linens and handkerchiefs and cravats. An easy start, they've laid it all out like a banquet. Go and steal us one of those fancy wipes, eh? Jacob stares. Show me how you do it, he said, not let me get myself arrested. How? How? The thief scoffs. How, he asks me. You either have the touch of it or you don't, Fagin, and there's only one way to tell. Do it, and we'll see. A smart person would turn away, understand this to be a sure path to Bridewell, and find another way to make his name. But Jacob takes a breath, then nods. Look alive, then, he thinks. As he did when trailing Leftwich, he weaves through the crowd, keeping to other people's shadows. Taking care not to jostle anyone, he must move slowly, but gradually he approaches the draper's table at an oblique angle. How did Leftwich do it at the Haymarket? It seemed so easy from a distance. Jacob would give anything for one more opportunity to observe. He would like to sketch diagrams, take measurements, plan his first theft like a tailor laying out pieces for a fine gown. But this, it seems, is a skill he must learn by doing. He falls into the wake of a woman with petticoats wide enough to nearly hide him from sight. There, safely concealed, he toys one final time with the idea of running away. No one would know. It would be as if nothing ever happened. Leftwich would chuckle at his failure and feel superior for 10 minutes, and then even he would forget the whole episode. He grits his teeth and clenches his fists. His bare knuckles ache, his dirty palms pierced by his own nails. These hands are all he has, but they will have to do. They are nearly past the shop when the woman pauses, eyeing a bolt of fabric at the far end of the table. How much? She asks the shopkeeper, pointing. 3 shillings the yard, the shopkeeper says. As fair a price as you'll find anywhere. It isn't, but the goods have her attention. No one is looking at him now. Fast as lightning, Jacob darts out a hand toward the opposite side of the table and crushes the nearest handkerchief in his palm. The silk against his skin feels like the finest thing he's ever touched. The woman is still asking about the quality of the fabric. Triumph. It is intoxicating. He can barely contain himself as he walks easily from the table, hands in his pockets, clutching his prize. He is a natural. His first time, no instruction, and he managed it right under the shopkeeper's nose. Gold, jewelry, food, money, fine clothes, all of it parades before his mind's eye, a dancing troupe of ghostly objects made animate by his own skill. He will have them. He will have everything. And he's nearly out of sight, too, before the cry goes up. Thief! Somebody stop that boy. Jacob takes off running. I do. I was 7 or 8 years old myself, and I was listening to the cassette tape that my grandmother had of Oliver the Musical, the 1994 Broadway cast. And I fell in love with the character of Fagin on
The songs
that.
are so good.
They're so good.
They're the best songs.
That's exactly.
Yeah.
He's gonna steal the show the second he comes on stage. He's the weird crime uncle everyone wishes they had. And so I eventually went and saw a production, and seeing it in person, I was just fascinated by that character. That was like electric to me. And then, eventually, 10 years or so later, I thought, I wonder what the book is like. I really enjoyed that show. Let me pick up the Dickens novel and see if it's any good. And the experience of encountering Fagin the way Dickens wrote him is a very different experience than the way that the show portrays him. And I kind of felt a little bit betrayed by experiencing in the novel that way. I mean, it's such a nothing of a character the way that Dickens writes it. It's just a villain there to be an anti-Semitic caricature of a evil person who kind of comes out of the shadows and has no real personality other than to be a problem for everyone around him. But I don't know if it was because I had already fallen in love with the stage musical, or I think there's something in Dickens's character at the same time that I still kind of loved, that he's been a problematic fave for me even so ever since. And so I was just like, I wish someone would give him a chance to stand up. Yeah.
So no one else has until now. Like, when did you realize it was going to be you to write this book?
I was checking Publishers Marketplace every day for a year, waiting for someone else to write
This is such a
book.
good idea.
Because I was sure someone was going to beat me to it.
Yeah.
I started it, it was 2021 maybe, so I had been kicking it around for a while, and as the draft was coming together, literally every morning I was like, okay, who sold the book about Fagin? Because someone's going to do it. But fortunately I finished it first before anybody did. So.
Yeah. Well, and I think it fits so beautifully in with kind of this genre that's been around for a while, but sort of emerging recently, like James or Percival Everett, like taking a character who's like problematic from a classic quote-unquote novel and just kind of giving them more depth and more meaning, and looking at what was life like for these kind of people living on the margins of society in these eras, and how does the whole story change when you kind of reorient it around that person. So what was it like when you were like, okay, I'm gonna write this book, hopefully no one else does. Like, how do you dive into that world of, we'll talk about the Dickens of it in a second, but like, of living as like a Jewish person in London in this era, like what kind of research is there for you to even do about that? From Chicago.
Right, from Chicago, not taking myself in a time machine and also to London.
Yeah.
There's quite a bit of research about sort of the European Jewish experience in the 19th century, and so I started just kind of like, the way I always do research is I pick up the biggest, broadest book that I can find. This one was like The Jews of Europe. And I'm like, okay, that's a starting place. And so I would kind of get like a lay of the land of where I've headed, but being able to focus it in on England was a really interesting research project to me, because most of what I knew about kind of the European Jewish experience was like Eastern Europe, Soviet, Russia, Poland, like that kind of era. That's a very different kind of experience. That was a very, like, the ruling party of those countries was actively passing laws and enacting violence against Jewish communities. And England wasn't necessarily like that in the 19th century.
Was England like a place where people fled to from those places?
To some, yeah, there was, London was sort of an immigration community, and so in Fagin the Thief, his family are immigrants who come to London from more of an Eastern European place. There had been a Jewish community in England for a while until, I want to say, the 1200s, when one of the Edwards was like expelled all of the Jews from England, because every country in Europe has expelled all of the Jews at some point. But yeah, the particular context of that 19th century English Jewish experience was odd, because there were highly placed, successful Jewish people in London at that time. There were Jewish members of parliament at that time, but there was still sort of a undercurrent of, we've expelled this community from our country before, and we could do it again. They're still not really part of the fabric of this country.
And so when you're researching, so you've got Jewish history that you're looking at, and then another part of that would just be London and like the slums that you're writing about. So how did you go about because if for people who haven't read the book yet, like you're getting into like detail, like granular details, or like street names and like what it was like, and this is around the corner from this, like how, and well, there's like the poverty map, right?
Yeah.
Explain that.
Yes. This was one of my favorite research tools in this book. Was the Victorians will make a map of anything, and so one of the best maps that I found was every kind of street corner and intersection in London that was coded by how often law enforcement would have to visit and what the average income of the people who lived there was. And so you can kind of really cross-reference, these are the parts of the city that are dangerous and that are really strapped for resources, and then you go, 6 blocks this way, and this is where the extremely wealthy people would live. And it was just really brought the city to life to me in a way. But there were all kinds of resources like that. The Victorians wrote about everything, and they documented everything. So if I had a question about, what did this particular building look like, someone had written an article about it at some point. So
That's what I love about English history. There's
Yes.
so many people, whatever you want to research, someone's written a book about it.
Someone
They
has.
love research. They love writing about their own history.
They do. They love, and Dickens himself loved looking at things
Talk
and
about
writing about them.
Okay, so Dickens, so just to sort of like put this all together, you've got Jewish history, you've got like the poverty map, the London history, and then you have to look at, presumably, Oliver Twist, like line by line, to like look at what are the events, because how much of those were like cornerstones for your book of things that had to happen and you had to work around?
Yeah. I must have read Oliver Twist a dozen times, which
God bless you.
at least it's one of the shorter Dickenses, which is nice. But yeah, I really quickly getting into that had to decide, okay, if this is no longer the story of a child named Oliver Twist, this is the story of Fagin. He is in maybe half of the book, so the other half of the book already I can kind of decide this is not relevant to me, but of what I have, what are the kind of the tentpole scenes that I want to make sure I'm writing to? What do I want to make sure I'm keeping from the original, and what, if anything, is not going to fit in the way that I'm telling it? And I kind of challenged myself from the beginning to change the least amount as possible, just kind of as partly as a challenge to myself, but because it, like, Dickens gives you so much in the original of the world that these characters live in, but he doesn't build them out, really. He's not interested in creating sort of a fully rounded person. He's writing in, this is a good character and this is a bad character. And so the challenge that I set myself kind of was, can I work with what he gave me in that box and see what would happen if we weren't working with stock figures anymore? What would a real person do in this frame?
So it's sort of like taking that scene and just turning the camera lens, like if it's a movie. And once the other people leave the room, Fagin is still in the room, and what does he do next? Or like what was he doing before? Was there anything, I don't want to get into spoilers. I mean, spoilers for Oliver Twist. Gazillion years old. Was there anything that Fagin did, like you're talking about he's the anti-Semitic stereotype, was there anything that he did in the book that you were just like, I can't have this in my book, this is too gross?
Yeah, there were 2 things, and one of them I just said I'm not doing that, and that was one of the scenes when Oliver first meets Fagin. It's his first night in Fagin's house, and he is sleeping badly and sees Fagin get up and kind of creep through the moonlight to like pull up a floorboard, and he takes out a giant box full of diamonds and counts them. I'm like, we're not doing that. That's ridiculous. So I threw that out. But the part that I was interested in playing with is the way that Dickens shows Fagin is he's kind of a collector of children. Like, he goes out and finds these vulnerable orphans and teaches them to steal and uses them for his own purposes. And you can't write the story of Fagin without figuring out what's his relationship with these kids like. And I didn't want it to be purely like predatory for profit, right? That didn't feel honest to me, and it didn't feel interesting either. That's what a villain you draw in Sharpie in 3 seconds would do. So I wanted to think, okay, this is a person who's bringing in these children and teaching them to break the law. Okay, not ideal. But why would somebody do that? Why is that happening? And I had to kind of play around with his motives without super changing what actually happens.
Yeah. It just seems like such a challenge to take the book and then build up, like we were talking about, like just kind of like, what was he thinking about? So part of that involves giving him a first name.
Yeah.
Part of it involves giving him a family background. How did you kind of develop his family?
Yeah, that was what frustrated me the most about Oliver Twist, is Fagin just appears. He has no first name, no background, no nothing. He has no community. He is the Jew, singular, standing by himself. And there's a throwaway line in the novel that I think Bill Sykes says, did you have any parents at all, or did you just come straight from the devil? And like, clearly what Dickens is implying is, no, he just came straight from the devil. This is a creature, not a person.
Yeah.
So I knew by the time we meet Fagin and Oliver Twist, he's alone. But I didn't think he would start out that way. So I wanted to kind of turn the clock back and think, what would a community for him have looked like, and what would have happened for him to lose that? And so his relationship with his mother kind of came out for me as a kind of a cornerstone for where he started. That was the kind of the one relationship that he had as a child to hold on to. The other relationship that was interesting to me was him and his father. And in the way that I've written it, his father was hanged as a thief before Jacob was born, so they never met. But there's this presence of kind of his father's path through life that goes through the whole book. This is a person he didn't know, but it's sort of a fate that's chasing him through it.
And that's sort of, you brought it up, so I don't want to be like spoilers, but like there are ghostly presences in this one.
You know I love a ghost.
Is there any of that in Oliver Twist, or that's like you, like this is really your book? Because I don't want to always just be comparing it to Oliver Twist, but like this is the story. That was the like basis, inspiration, but then you made it a book and part of your book because it's you.
Yeah.
In ghostly presences.
Yeah, there are no actual ghosts in Oliver Twist. There's one chapter where Fagin and Oliver's half-brother think they see a ghost, and I saw that, I was like, that's where the ghost
Canon.
Yeah, but I figured Dickens would be okay with it. He wrote enough ghosts.
Yeah,
So.
fair. No, exactly. And actually, speaking of Dickens, what are your thoughts of Charles Dickens and how he wrote, not just Fagin, but other Jewish characters?
Oh, what are my thoughts on how long do you have for me to talk
I
about
don't know,
You have 20 minutes.
Okay, well, we're not going to do that for 20 minutes, I promise. But I think we have a tendency as a reading public to think, oh, well, it was the biases of the time. This is just how people believed back then, and we kind of excuse it as, it's fine. It was a different time. They didn't know any better. But what I like about Dickens's experience writing Jewish characters is that at the time, some people did know better, and they told him. He got letters from readers after he published Oliver Twist, not a lot, but enough, saying, Charles Dickens, you stood up as this hero of the poor and oppressed in London. You wrote these novels trying to get people to enact social change, and then you wrote this, and like, how do you reconcile that? How do you see, do you not see what you're doing to your only Jewish character, and how that's counter to what you're trying to do? And he stewed on that for a decade before he tried to write another Jewish character, and he did. He wrote the character of Raya in Our Mutual Friend, which is only other Jewish character, and that character it's commonly read as his apology for Fagin. It's just a very kind, self-sacrificing, lovely man who's never said a mean word to anybody in his life, and he sacrifices everything for the girl he's trying to help, and I hate that character so much. He's so boring, and he lets every Christian character in that book call him the worst names you've ever heard, and he just takes it all and never stands up for himself. And so, while I think Dickens did see maybe what I did the first time was not great, and he tried to learn, I still like Fagin better, personally.
Yeah.
I think he's more interesting and had more potential for a story that I wanted to read than this kind of idealized nothing of a character.
Yeah. Well, and I think that is part of what's really interesting about your book, and I've seen you describe it this way as well, that there's kind of no good people in
No.
the book. Like, everyone is kind of a dirtbag, brackets, not always positive, often negative. Like, so what was it like to write a book I don't need to write a book and then also to present it to your agent, to your editor, be like, hey, here's this book full of terrible people. They're all terrible. Like, I don't know, what was the response like to that?
I had a very patient publishing team who saw what I was trying to do, fortunately, and they were cautious about it, and in revisions they did have me, my editor gave me the best note while I was revising the character of Bill Sykes. She said, I know you love him, but someone else has to know why you love him. He has to have something nice about him, otherwise you're gonna seem like a sociopath. So I didn't want to overly sanitize any of them. Like you said, there are no heroes in this book. This is not we flip the camera and now Fagin is the good guy hero going out to save the world. It's not that. But they are people who are making sometimes terrible decisions, but for reasons that hopefully the reader can understand and empathize with. And in some ways, like, I find dirtbags to be the most interesting people, and so I wanted to tell stories about characters who are making bad decisions and making their lives more difficult, but for reasons that we can follow because they believe they're doing the best they can with what they have.
Exactly, like reading a book, for people who haven't read it yet, it's not just like a bunch of horrible people being horrible.
For no
like,
reason.
Yeah, like they're sympathetic even if you don't agree with what their ultimate decisions are. It's like, well, I see why he did that, but it's kind of like, ugh, it's too bad.
I wish you wouldn't though. Yeah.
But that's kind of too bad. I don't know if I've ever read Oliver Twist, but I know that I've seen Oliver the musical. And so I was reading through it. I didn't want to remind myself of the plot of Oliver Twist because I wanted to experience the plot just through your book. And so I was like, oh, that's right. And then characters come in who I remember from the musical. So Nancy, I'm like, oh God, Nancy. I remember.
It's the correct response.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She has a really sad song. Bill Sykes.
Yeah.
But then also, when I was reading the book, I was like, wait a minute. I think I'm noticing some lyrics from the musical Oliver. And then I thought, no, not necessarily. Maybe those are words from the book, and then they're turned at the musical, and Allison's reusing text from the book. So like, someone says, that's your funeral. When Bill Sykes comes in, he's like, remember my name? I'm like, that's a song. I remember that song.
It is.
And then it mentions Nancy was at a pub and she was singing a song, standing on a table, and everyone sang along. I'm like, that's Papa. I know. She's singing Allison in front of witnesses. Did you quote Oliver the musical in your book?
Yes. And I'm not ashamed. I tell people, like, I've told a lot of people I'm writing an Oliver Twist retelling, and they're all like, oh God, do I have to go out and read Oliver Twist? And no, you don't. I wanted this book to be able to stand, whether you have background in that novel, whether you've read Dickens and love Dickens, I wanted it to have something to offer to those readers, but I also wanted it to be accessible and interesting for people who saw the musical one time in elementary school, or saw Oliver and Company, the Disney movie with the dogs and the Billy Joel music. That's also fine.
Yeah.
It's just like, it is a story that stands on its own, and I think the characters that Dickens created are interesting enough that they can stand on their own without needing to soak through all of the Dickens of it all.
I'm just glad I recognize the song lyrics.
And I'm very proud of you.
Thank you. There's also some sequences, if anyone's familiar with the movie Newsies, which was about newsboys in New York. There's some scenes in here with Fagin's like youth, the young men who's trained to be thieves, sort of hanging out, young boys smoking cigars, and I was like, this makes me think of Newsies. Allison, were you inspired by Newsies?
I gotta tell you, any like 10 to 14-year-old boys standing around causing mischief, that is inspired by Newsies always, because that's a perfect film.
No, so it's fun to I was proud of myself. I don't always I don't know other authors as well as I know you, but I was just like, I think I might know if it's inspiration for you.
And this is why you're a dangerous reader.
But those are the Easter eggs for everybody else to enjoy.
Yes.
But I was wondering about the role of the female characters in this. So I know from the musical, Nancy and Bet are in that, and they're in this book as well. And so what was it like looking at their characters and trying to revisit them, not as just like, oh God, poor Nancy, but it's like, who is she as a person?
Yeah, I came into this project knowing, okay, Fagin was done dirty by the original, and I want to figure out what that actual person would be like. Nancy was the other one that I wanted to figure out. And again, Dickens actually also got pushed back for the way that he portrayed Nancy in his original novel. And for those who haven't experienced the novel recently, Nancy has one character trait, and it's I love Bill, and I will put up with absolutely anything that he does to me because I love him. She is a suffering, battered woman who doesn't really have any agency outside of that relationship, and when Dickens was questioned on that, he really did double down on it and say, sometimes this is how it is. This is what, sometimes women in abusive relationships are like this. And that frustrated me in that response because I've always felt that his treatment of Nancy is not patronizing exactly, but I didn't feel like he was asking the right questions of her.
Mm-hmm.
Dickens was asking the question, how much will she put up with, and how strong is she, and how much can she suffer? And I wanted to ask the question, why is she there? Why is she with Bill, and why does she stay with him? And the more time I spent with her, it felt like there had to be something there at the beginning of their relationship that was worth staying for even after it got bad. And it does get bad, but it seemed wrong to me to start it there and say, she's choosing to suffer because she doesn't think she deserves to be happy. That
Yeah.
didn't feel right.
I want to just clarify for everybody too that in your book we meet Nancy before Nancy meets Bill, so we see who
Right.
she is as a person before she comes to this relationship. So you and I assume on purpose
Yeah.
to kind of show who she is, so she's not only defined by that relationship.
Right. She exists outside of it, but it is important for her life. And so I wanted to show, what does a relationship like that look like for a person like her in a more nuanced way than just, she'll yeah.
Yeah. Well, which brings up Bill Sykes as well as a character. I just remember from the musical as just being like, oh God, this guy.
Yeah. That's also the correct response to Bill.
Yeah. No, so I found
This
it really
guy.
interesting because you first introduced him as a younger person.
Yeah.
And I think it's funny. I don't think this is a spoiler to say, Fagin asks him, how old are you? 13? And he thinks that he's underestimating it. And how old are you? 15? He's like, oh no, I'm 13. He looks like a 25-year-old man.
Right.
At 13. He's just you say something like, he was never meant to be a child. This was a human being who was never really a child.
Yeah.
So what's that like to write somebody who's that damaged, I guess?
Yeah.
Who you love, clearly.
Problematically so, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Bill is a mess, and I didn't expect to care about him as much as I did by the end of this project because, in every adaptation, Bill Sykes has no redeeming qualities. Bill Sykes is toxic masculinity personified in a frightening figure, and that was not something that was immediately interesting or sympathetic to me, but as I was trying to figure out Fagin and I was trying to figure out Nancy, Bill is such a big part of their lives. He shapes the whole world that they're in, and in order to understand why they're with him, I had to understand who he was, and he's the one with the most danger in him, and he was really difficult to figure out, but the more time I spent with him, he is making every wrong decision you can make. He is the definition of hurt people, and that's not to excuse anything that he does in the novel, but it made sense to me that he was so frightened of not being strong enough to protect himself that he became this powerful figure of violence, because if you're stronger than everyone around you, you can't be hurt.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There's a scene in the book as well, and this is back to Fagin, where he has the jacket full of little jangly things to train people how to steal without making the things jangle.
Yeah.
Is that an Oliver Twist, or is that just in the musical?
It's an Oliver Twist,
Okay.
and it's also a real thing that real thieves actually did.
Yes, I want to talk to you about. There's so much information in this book. It's a real how-to guide to be a pickpocket in 1830s London.
Yes.
So you learn things like that.
Yeah.
How did you learn about all the specific things you have? It's very. I was like, oh, that's how that works. Okay.
Yeah, once again, those wacky Victorians and their books for everything. I read, it's called London Labour and the London Poor by Henry Mayhew, which is not a page turner, but it's 500 to 700 pages about how every class in London would kind of go through the day and make a living, and there's a whole section of it that's the criminal classes of London. And so this guy, Henry Mayhew, went out into London in the 1850s, 1860s.
And people just
like,
told him what they did?
yeah, he was just like, hi, I'm a journalist and I'm writing a book about how people do crime. Can you tell me how you do crime? And there's
Sure, I can.
and they sure did, because you could talk to anybody.
Yeah.
So there are just pages and pages about here's how an adult thief would train a child thief. This is like, they'll do the game with the coat, and you'll put the handkerchief in the coat pocket and see if the kids can come in and
Yeah.
catch it. And there's pages and pages about how you would rob somebody on a bus in 1850s London. So if anyone ever wants to learn how to do that, now I know how to do that.
Did you try?
I didn't try because I'm not coordinated enough to do it, but in theory I could do it.
And also you have a lot of details. I think it's the same writer wrote a book about prisons.
Yes.
Because there's a lot of specifics. There's so much specifics. It's a really readable book. It's not just like that.
Like, you're really selling this.
But there's so many parts in it. I'm just like, wow, there's so much. I'm like, and I know that you do the research. So I'm like, I'm sure this is true. There's a part where like someone's coming out of jail and they're like, well, I know that they're usually let out of jail at 7 p.m. But there's so much paperwork that don't come out till 10 p.m. I'm just like, all this information, like about jails. Like it was the same sort of thing, right?
It was the same sort of thing, and that one was the same guy. Because after I finished reading his giant book with every fact I ever wanted to know, I was like, I wonder what else this guy did. As I looked him up on Google Books, and his other one was a 900-page book about all of the prisons in London. I was like, this guy is amazing. So I should have dedicated this book to Henry Mayhew, the most helpful man.
You would never know.
Oh, I think he'd be thrilled.
Could you set the scene also for everybody? Because I was confused, not by you, but just by myself, by not really knowing a lot about Oliver Twist. I thought that this story took place like later in the 1800s, but the time period of your book, like the events of Oliver Twist, it's like what, 1830 or something like that?
Yeah, I chose to set my book in the year Oliver Twist was published, which was 1838. That's when the serialization in the newspapers finished. And so I decided that's when the events of Oliver Twist happened. And so in that kind of timeline, my Fagin is in his 50s. And so I wanted to then kind of turn the clock back to follow his whole life. So the book starts in 1830, but then kind of goes back into the 1780s and 90s and works its way up.
And how different were things? I mean,
From
society, from then, like the 1790s to the 1830s, like what Fagin's experience, like in your research as well, where it's like, well, this is what prisons were, this is what these were like, but like 25 years later, maybe it was different. Like, how were you able to show that passage of time?
That's a funny question, because in the grand scheme of, English history between the 1770s and the 80s and the 1830s, enormous change, like the American Revolution and the entire Regency period and all of that.
Industrialization.
The Industrial Revolution is just starting at that point, yeah. But what was interesting was looking at the story of the poor in London at that time. Didn't change all that much. The big kind of societal changes that are happening and the revolution sweeping across Europe, that's one thing. But I still don't have enough money to make it to my next meal. That was kind of a constant through this, and it would progressively get worse as the entire Industrial Revolution would happen. But it was kind of a funny feeling as I was researching the time period. I had to keep reminding myself, oh yeah, this is when Bridgerton was happening, and this is a completely different world. But it is, this is happening at the same time. This is Jane Austen's England, but it's not at all really.
That's so interesting just to think, like, for the poor, effectively it wasn't that different, whether it's 1790 or 1830.
Right. We went through in this book, I think it's 3 kings and a queen, and I don't think any of the characters in my book particularly notice or care.
Yeah, which I appreciate. Because when I was kings was my least favorite. George the Fourth. Who you do insult slightly in the book, and I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
So in terms of, what was I gonna say? So you're looking at in the book like this time period, like what he was doing, training these young thieves. Like he finds sort of like a business for himself of like getting these young people, and they would steal things, and that would help him get money. How would you see Fagin working in today's society? What grift do you think he would be up to?
Yeah, I've thought about this, and I think there are 2 paths that a 2025 Jacob Fagin would follow, and there's one that is the legal path, and I was thinking, oh, what would he do if he actually had to get a job? and I decided, second grade public school teacher. I think he'd be incredible.
But with kids.
And he would be in trouble with the administration every single day of his life.
Yeah.
But they would love him.
Yeah.
Was the path I saw. And then there was if we weren't happy side of the law, what grift would he get up to? And I was thinking, multi-level marketing schemes seems likely to me. Because I think A, he'd be a great salesperson, and B, you can immediately recruit other people to go out and recruit other people, and he'd be great at that too.
Yeah. Well, because part of his whole deal was just the charisma
Yeah.
that he had. Like, he wouldn't have been able to have, like, as much success as he had as a thief, as, like, this sort of, like, father figure to these, like, people sort of mentoring, if he hadn't been magnetic in some way.
Mm-hmm.
Like, to get people wouldn't work for him if he didn't have some sort of charisma. So I feel like,
Yeah.
I could see him online. Luring in some
Selling
people.
supplements door to door, I don't know.
Or something like that, for sure. What has the response been like from, like, you've done a couple of events so far. You've talked to some people who've read the book,
Yeah.
besides me.
I have talked to you about it a lot, but I have also talked to other people.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
what sorts of things have people, have they mentioned, is there anything surprising you of what people are finding in the book or saying about it?
I've been really relieved to hear how people who are big fans of Dickens have responded to it.
Yeah.
Because I thought it would be an interesting story for historical fiction people who aren't necessarily very big Dickens fans, because the Victorian era is a big pull for readers, and so I thought, okay, I'll get some of those people, but people who like Dickens really, really like Dickens, and so I wanted to present the world in a way that felt respectful to Dickens, but also challenging it, and that was a really tough line to walk, and I've been pleasantly surprised by Dickens fans who have told me that they did enjoy it, and
Good.
that I hadn't, I was very worried, so I'm
Yeah.
a little bit relieved by
Well,
that.
because you say, like, you really looked at the book to be like, what's in the text, and, like, to use that. You're not changing anything major, comma,
Yeah,
spoilers.
it's the comma and that was the concern, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it just has to do with some stuff that Dickens put in the book about, like, what was the actual sentence for this actual crime, and
Yeah, or now that I put so much of myself into these characters that it's sort of evolved the way that I think they would behave in certain
Yeah.
situations that Dickens wrote. Like, there are some scenes in the original that I had to kind of recast in my version, just because now that I've spent so much time building out a motivation and a backstory for this character, I don't think they would behave the way that Dickens has them
Yeah.
behave. They would do something different. They didn't feel accurate anymore for them to behave that way.
can I talk about Oliver Twist in that context?
Yes.
That little kid.
Uh-huh.
What is your take on your Oliver Twist in this book, as seen through Fagin's eyes, is different from the, like, pure-hearted little angel of the musical, for instance?
Yeah. I've described my Oliver Twist as a kid who would stab you through the eye for a quarter, which I personally think is, number one, a little bit more interesting, and two, probably more accurate to the kind of child that he would have had to be in the story that Dickens is telling, because that kid is on his own at the age of 6 or 7, and I mean, Dickens shows him surviving through a workhouse and then running away to London, which was like a 50-mile walk by himself, and then making his own life. And I don't think you get that kind of survival instinct without, being willing to stand up for yourself and do what you have to do to get by. And so I wanted to show that side of him for the amount that Oliver is in this book. He's not in a whole lot. It's not his story anymore, but I
Yeah.
did want to show him sort of in what I felt was a more human and probable kind of way.
Well, I mean, the same as with Fagin and with Nancy,
Yeah.
with Bill Sykes. It's just like, make this a human.
Right.
How would they behave, instead of making it like this right from the devil, or this, like, Oliver's kind of like this angel. It's like, well, if you're not writing an allegory, if you're writing about,
Right.
like, messy, real, poor people who have to survive.
Right, and I think it's worth saying that what I'm doing is not what Dickens was doing. He was
Yeah.
writing a different kind of book.
Mhm.
I've described it as sort of it's like a fairy tale, right? You have your hero, your little child who goes off into the big bad world and meets villain 1 and villain 2, and the villains get what's coming to them, and the kid gets his happily ever after. And as far as that goes, Oliver Twist was a success in that way. But if it was trying to be realism from a character perspective, it's not trying to do that, so it doesn't do that.
Yeah, well, I mean, that just makes me think of things like movies, like Wicked, for instance, where it's just like taking like this, what if that wasn't the villain? what would make that person do those things. So I think your book fits in that pantheon, also just taking like a classic villain. There's even books like this for teenagers and for children that are like, what if Maleficent or the Evil Queen or Gaston? Like, well, why did Gaston do that? You know, so it's a classic thing that people think about a lot of stories, I think.
Yeah, I've never read one about Gaston.
Oh, there is one book.
Is there?
It's probably here.
Okay.
I forget what
I'll
it's
look
called.
that up.
No, it's definitely a series. I think it's probably around time that we can take some questions from people. I hope you have questions, because I've run out of questions.
I have one.
Yeah.
So I'm curious what it's like emotionally, like the emotional fallout of living with a character or with the research project for such a long time, because you said it's been in the works, you know, in your head even longer than what the 4 years of actually getting this book to production. What is that like? Like, how do you come down from that? And are you even given a chance to sort of emotionally recuperate before having to launch into the next project?
Yeah, I'm currently coming down from that. So it's strangely for this book, it's been really nice to kind of send it out into the world, because I've just wanted to talk about it with people for so long. And before the book is out, it's very hard to find someone who wants to talk to you about Fagin for 3 hours. So it's been fun to have other people who have kind of sat with it to some extent and hear what other people are feeling and thinking about it. There is a deep terror that comes with that too. Here's everything I've thought about for years. I hope you like it, and if you don't, okay.
Well, it's very vulnerable, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But fortunately, it's been a really good experience so far, and I've also been able to kind of sit in that moment for a little bit, to just talk about this book and not worry quite yet about what's next or what am I working on. I'm having the moment for this, and after that I'll be able to think about what comes after. Yeah.
I read the book, then I bought it the day it came out, and I think you did a masterful job of interviewing it.
Oh, thank
You covered about all my questions. In fact, I have probably what is going to be the most boring question you will get in all your tours.
Well, that's a challenge now, and
Well,
I'm excited.
it has to do with font. It has to do
I'm
with...
so happy you have a font question.
Well, because first of all, in your dirt bag, you mentioned the drop caps. The
Yes.
Drop, yes. So that got my curiosity up. And then when I was reading the book, and then I noticed that just before the chapter, the section breaks, there's a little change in the font.
Yes.
And I was trying to figure out why. One of them is the letter that the mama writes, and then the others I just couldn't figure out. And I know everything is done for a purpose.
Yes.
This one's just arbitrary. So, and I hope, I don't want to be giving anything away, but
No.
why?
Yeah, the last chapter in each section is told from a different point of view. Every other chapter is focused close in on Fagin, and those two branch, the three, the letter, and then the other two branch out into other characters' points of view, and so they get slightly different
They
fonts
are?
or slightly different framing. Yes.
I'll go back and look.
Yeah.
I thought of that, and I didn't pick up, I'll go back and look. Thank you. Yeah. And by the way, I love, again, I thought your questions were great. I thought you navigated all of those pitfalls you could have fallen into. Handling Fagin and doing the character. I thought you handled that just beautifully.
Thank you so
You're a
much.
wonderful writer. I've read all your books. I'm a dirtbag. I love your writing. And
you
it's
so
terrific
much.
to see you in person.
Wonderful
And
to
your
see you.
persona is not like I would thought it would be. Reading dirtbags.
We need to listen to
I-
the podcast.
Yeah.
Because of Vulgar History.
I haven't heard the podcast. Okay.
She's a frequent contributor.
Yes.
Yes.
Friend of the pod.
Can we talk about font a bit more?
Please.
Because there's a thing at the beginning of every chapter where there's like one big letter.
My drop caps,
Your
yeah.
drop cap.
So is that like did Charles Dickens do that? Like why did you choose to do that? I assume that was your choice.
It wasn't, and it was a delightful surprise. Because I love fonts, as apparently a lot of you already know. It's one of the best parts about publishing is that you get to see it laid out in fonts like a real book, and that's exciting every time. But they chose to do sort of those big feature letters in the
Yeah.
beginning just for style, and it reminds me of an old tiny illuminated manuscript that just makes me happy every time I look.
So that happens.
Yes, it was.
You weren't like, I need drop caps.
No, the only thing I asked when we sent the final manuscript to production, they said, "Do you want anything?" And I was like, "Yes, but like, what do you want me to ask for?" And I asked, there are like 3 very small newspaper articles in the book, and I asked, "Can I have a newspaper font. And I felt really nervous to ask, because I thought they would tell me no, I was being
Yeah.
too extravagant. And then I remembered, this is a digital publishing, they don't have to switch the font case up. So they did that.
Yeah.
You ever have a problem asking a publisher for something, you know where I am.
I do, it can be my
I
habit.
made them change the density of my font one time.
Other font or non-font. Oh, just her back there.
Is Fagin a name that is known in the community? Is that a made-up Dickens last name? Like, where did that come from?
Yeah, funny enough, the name, Dickens got the name Fagin from a guy he used to work with when he worked in like the boot blacking factory as a child. One of the people who worked in the factory was named Bob Fagin, and he just liked the last name and gave it to the character Fagin in Oliver Twist, and I have to feel like that guy was not thrilled with the way it came out. It is a last name. I don't know that it's a traditionally Jewish last name, but I think he just liked the sound of it.
Any other question?
Yeah, what are some strange details that you found either in your research or brainstorming that you wanted to put in the novel but didn't make the final cut?
There's so many of
In
them.
his 900 page.
Yeah, those wacky Victorians, man. I couldn't find a way to make this make sense in the novel. It was so irrelevant, but it's one of my favorite weird Victorian facts, which is the whole Egyptology craze in the Victorian era. You all are my people. That you're all like, yeah, the weird things the Victorians did with mummies. Yes. But I couldn't figure out a way to have my characters obtain an Egyptian artifact in any way. But the Victorians were obsessed with mummies and would just like, of course, you know, go out and bring them back to the British Museum, but then also to their home and just keep them in their like curio cabinets.
And they would like grind them up into powder and use that as paint.
Sometimes they would
unwrapping
drink it.
parties.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like I'd pay to be a fly on a wall and an unwrapping party just to experience.
So that came up when I was researching, and I was like, should I? Oh, my editor will be so mad at me if she has to tell me to take that out.
This is like what I foresee is somebody could write like a inspired by your book, new book, but it's sort of like Indiana Jones meets Fagin. And he's kind of like breaking into museums, stealing artifacts.
Oh my god.
Next project.
I have to
Oh.
go right now.
Or fan fiction, regular fan fiction. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Amazing.
But this was fan fiction though.
Oh, fair. Yeah.
Yeah.
So fan fiction after fan fiction.
Absolutely.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, this being your third book, have you noticed like a trend in the types of characters you like to write about and kind of what draws you to that kind of character?
Yeah, I've kind of come to accept that my preferred kind of character is an absolute mess who never makes a good decision in their life. So I sort of embraced that to the max here. But I think the other thing that I notice my characters are trying to figure out a lot is they don't quite belong where they are. And there's that sense of trying to make a place for you in a world that doesn't want you the way that you are. And that's shown up sort of in all of the characters I've written and care about the most. But I don't know what that says about me. Yeah.
It's just kind of fun to look around and see how wide the demographic of this audience is. So I'm curious, did you have a specific demographic in mind when you're writing your books, or was this just kind of a surprise?
This is, I didn't have a demographic in mind. I had a kind of person that I thought would enjoy a book like this, and I've described my ideal reader as English majors, theater nerds, and people who just want to yell at you about the Victorians. And so that's any of you. There we go. No, but it's really wonderful to find it resonating with people who, you know, similar background for me, different background for me. I think that, you know, it's part of the reason why Dickens has stayed around for so long is there's something in there for everybody, and it's nice to kind of tap into that.
Other questions?
Even if we hate him.
Even if you hate him.
I was telling Allison earlier, I used to have a job working at a theater box office. And sometimes people they would see a play and they wouldn't like it, and they'd say, I want my money back because I didn't like the play. And what we were told to tell them, which I still believe, it's like, well, you didn't pay to enjoy the play. You pay to experience the play. And so I feel like Charles Dickens, whether you think about him or his books, it's like, well, his books are an experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, like, lest it sound like I've been bashing on Dickens for an hour, like, he's incredible. And I think he's incredibly good at what he does. And there's a reason that they're classics, and there's a reason that I wanted to write a book set in his world. I just wanted to do something slightly different in it. And I've described it as like Dickens put together a great sandbox in Oliver Twist, and I'm like, do you mind if I play in here now that you're done? And, you know, there's lots to do.
Actually, I have a question.
Yeah.
Who is your favorite Fagin performer that you've heard or seen in a movie, or there's been like mini-series, like the musical, obviously. Like, who's your Fagin at your heart? Who are you picturing when you're writing this book?
I wasn't picturing any of this. Is a very particular person in my head, and I know what he looks like. And so whenever anyone asks me what's your fan cast for Fagin, I'm like, no, it's just it's the guy that I picture. That's what that is. But the adaptation that I liked recently of Fagin, I really liked David Thewlis's Fagin from The Artful Dodger on Disney Plus, which is like, it's a real popcorn show. It's goofy.
Because that's like The Artful Dodger after Oliver Twist is in Australia and is a doctor or something.
It's a wild show.
And Fagin is there in Australia?
He shows up in Australia.
Why not?
Yeah, why not? But there's the way that they play him in that adaptation is the right mix of like interesting but a little bit scary, and I found him really, really watchable.
Yeah.
I've been searching a lot for like the ideal portrayal of Fagin in an adaptation. I don't know that I've seen one that hits everything I want, but that one got a lot of it.
Okay. Are there other questions? Yeah.
Can you tell us what you're writing about next?
I just had a very nervous email thread with my agent 2 days ago where I'm like, I might be doing this, but I don't know. And she's like, good luck, you'll figure it out.
You know what?
So-
No, related to that, well, because I don't know if you can say what you're writing, but when you first had this project, I remember you told me, and you sent this to your agent, and she's like, oh, I didn't know you were a Charles Dickens fan.
Oh, you don't know a lot about me, Bridget.
And you're like, that's not why I wrote
That's
this.
not.
But like the response to this book in the first place, I think it took a while for her to understand what you were getting at, and like for you to explain to the editors.
Well,
You changed the title of this book, didn't you?
the title was changed.
Oh, the title was
Well,
changed.
someone changed
Oh,
was
title.
changed.
It's called Our Rotten Hearts or something?
Yes, that was the second title. I'll tell you the brief title saga if you're curious. Because,
Yes, yeah.
when I sent the manuscript to my editor, the finished draft, it was just called Fagin. That's what I had been calling it. And we went through, we did notes, we did edits, and then she took it to the publisher to see what they thought. And the publisher said, well, we're not sure that, modern booksellers and modern readers are going to know who Fagin is. And so we think in the title, we're going to have to give him something more than that. So can you come up with something that's a little bit more vibey? And so I hate titling books. So I took 2 weeks and came up with probably 40 different titles that just had Oliver Twist energy to them. And the one we went with was Our Rotten Hearts, which is from a quote that Nancy says about Bill in Oliver Twist. And that's the one that we announced the book with, and that's the one that we designed the first cover with, and I revealed the first cover to the world. And the week after we revealed the first cover to the world, the sales team sent me an email and said, we actually think this book would sell better if it had Fagin in the title, so we think people really know who Fagin is. And I was like, do you now? So we very quickly went to my very talented, very patient cover designer and said, hey, can you redo exactly what you did but with a brand new title, and can you have it tomorrow? So we changed midstream, and that sometimes that's publishing, baby.
But it hadn't been printed.
It hadn't been printed.
Yeah.
It hadn't. Yeah, it was still early enough that you get kind of a fun trivia fact that some people know what the original title was.
Yeah.
But now and I'm personally very happy with the title we have now because it's sort of what I was calling it to begin with. So it feels like, okay, this is what I was writing it as.
Well, and I like this Fagin the Thief,
Mhm.
because it's like, oh, do I know that person? Oh, that's that character.
That's the one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
You're
true.
an excellent title person. You're just writing in the wrong genre. Because if you were writing cozy mysteries,
Oh, if I was writing cozy mysteries,
She is so
the
good
woman
at
is a
puns.
pun machine.
She's so good at puns.
Beth best day of my life is when a friend of mine said, I just finished the draft of my cozy mystery and I need a title. And I said, sit down a minute. I said for 30 up.
It's your fault.
I know, I can't write mystery though.
When we can do it was.
We can be a team.
I think we have time for one more question. Somebody wants to close us out?
So I hope this isn't too much of a spoiler, but there wasn't really, like, there's no Fagin romance. And I was wondering if that was like a deliberate choice or just it doesn't really fit.
Yeah, it was a deliberate choice, actually. I had that conversation with my team as we were revising. They said, you've written, romances in your previous books. Is that something you're interested in exploring here? And I told them, it's not. I don't see that for this character. It wasn't the way that I understood him. I understand him as a person who's very, not frightened of intimacy. That's not exactly the right word, because I do think part of it is just he's satisfied with relationships that are not romantic relationships. That's not something that I thought this character was seeking. But there was also the sense of isolation and the sense of the need for belonging was so important for him that introducing a romantic relationship for him felt like a distraction from that, and also like it didn't feel real for that character. So I did think about it and then think that's not right for him. It doesn't go here.
You got close.
I got close, and then I said no.
All right. Thank you, Allison.
Thank you all for coming out on a
Yeah.
terrible night.
You can catch Allison right up the glass display case.
Which is where I'm gonna go.
We didn't use the microphone.
Oh, yeah, we did.
That really hurt.
So, keep going on.
Perfect, that's the goal.
Great questions.
Thank you.
Go ahead. You're
No, please don't.